I say in my daily work all the time with the young men that I interact with that I struggled with identity. We all have a different journey, but one of the things that really was a burden for me was trying to figure out where I thought I belonged with regard to higher education and pursuit of certain kind of certain standard of living, certain jobs. So those were two really big kind of components that came together for me.
I think one of the things also that has really been heavy on my mind recently is that when we talk about the healing that needs to happen in the world, we have this way of kind of kicking the can down the road. You're at a cocktail party and somebody will say something like, oh, well, yeah, the young people, they're going to figure it out. And they are so much, they're really on it and they're going to make the world a better place. And I'm going, okay, now I know people have been saying that for at least 6 decades and it hasn't quite happened yet. So then what is our role? In fact, there's something someone just shared with me today, something that was rather disturbing, is that teens are at least as, and in some cases more racially polarized than their parents. So this notion of where do I belong and modeling that and not and refusing to be circumscribed by cultural narratives, that is, I think that's where we have to put our attention now.
To your point, and to hear you talk about the notion of racial polarization and how that's even something that we should be paying attention to. Like, I don't see that on a lot of dashboards or in messaging. We talk about the socio-emotional supports we should be giving to young people. And it's an interesting experience in some of the programming that I've been a part of to talk to colleagues in other parts of the country who will say, well, primarily we see this sort of identification. Maybe people are saying, well, I'm Latinx and I'm African American, or I'm, Southeast Asian, and that's how I identify. And those groupings are enough for some folks, or they're the kind of points of tension. Whereas in New York and a couple of other markets, we'll see people get a lot more granular about their identities and say, yeah, well, just because I fit into this larger label, I happen to have family, my heritage is from Ecuador and that person's heritage is from, El Salvador. And we are not the same. We don't have the same sort of political needs or the same sort of social needs. And when you talk about the identity alone, kind of grappling with feeling a sense of safety in being who you are is one element. And that really needs to be left up to us as individuals. But then we also think about in a lot of our work, how do we describe larger political narratives to someone who's trying to figure out, do I belong in that narrative, in that story? Is that for me? Should I, and to make it plain, are you talking to me when you say I need to vote? Are you saying that people are if I don't do it, then it's going to be an issue for me because there are forces trying to take away my rights or my access? So that I think that's really powerful, really, really powerful.
Yeah, and the fact that sometimes we get lost in calling identity a box. You check a box and that's supposed to say who you are. It does not help people to show up whole, and it does not in any way help us to realize the emotional impact, the political impact of what we call identity in this country, and how this country has always used it in a rather polarizing way. I've just come across this term called racecraft, and it's kind of like witchcraft. And what I like about it is that it makes us focus on not checking a box, but on the work that race has done in this nation since its inception. And it's all been about defining who belongs where and how much power a person can have and who can have access to power. And oh, by the way, once you get it, what can you do with it? So this sort of racecraft notion is kind of like, working with ourselves, working with young people to say, okay, how is race working on me today, even when I'm not paying attention to it? And how do I sort of move into a larger imagination of who I can be? and not what some box says. I don't have to choose between, oh, this year and of course I've lived long enough to been through, I've been through a lot of boxes, right? My boxes started with colored, then it went to Negro, and then all of a sudden Negro got a capital N, and then and then finally we got to, the 70s, the 60s, and the late 70s, where many of the artists and the activists were saying, hey, we're going to reclaim this word Black. And Black is expansive. It's no longer pejorative. And so that, we can claim it in any way we want, but not think of it as something that we need to be ashamed of.
I think that is an empowering statement, is what I want to say about that. As much as I thought about some of the things I have input, stop the presses. That is a call to action, and I believe that that's a great description of the starting point, right? Where can you and I and the rest of our community have a conversation about what we have in common and what benefits all of us? Only when I get to a place where I have become comfortable enough with who I am and how I come to be in community, that I can come, open with an open mind and willing to kind of share and collaborate. Otherwise, right, I'm actually coming to that conversation with different needs, and I'm not ready to share. And it's such a vital point that I think, because it's difficult, it's nuanced, right? It's not something you can't check a box and say, great, I had the identity conversation with you, you're good to go, move on to the next stage. It's like, it doesn't work that way. Right. So it's difficult to take into consideration, I think, for organizations, even within our politics to some extent. Wait, we're talking about all these labels and how everybody's fighting, but are we taking a step back to say, well, who exactly is that, that you said is on the other side of the fence? For me, and it matters, to close my thought, just to say that when I mentioned this earlier, as a kid, what neighborhood I came from, my socioeconomic status. When I was younger, it seemed very much in the culture. And I didn't understand at that point how much it was in the system. I almost thought of my socioeconomic status as part of my tribal identity, if you will, as part of like, well, this is where I come from. This is how things look and sound and feel here. And it took me a while to really grasp, well, it doesn't have to be this way. And this isn't a result solely of our own agency. We didn't make the decisions that brought us, solely to this place. And that was important, for me to say, you're going to go to college, you're going to educate yourself in whatever way would make sense for me, but learn about my own history and understand kind of my place and get confident.
And isn't it amazing how the labels tend to be so dehumanizing and monolithic? So once that label is slapped, then it's supposed to mean all sorts of things. And we forget about the rest of who we are and what we care about and, how we aspire and who our folks are. So it's sort of claiming humanity when you start saying, no, this one label doesn't mean the same thing across a broad spectrum of people. When I wrote my book, my working title was Who Do You Think You Are? And I thought that was kind of pithy and kind of clever and all of that, but it certainly leaves out a whole lot, because some of the rest of it is, who do people think I am? And what difference does it matter? Because I can think I'm anything in my head, but if I walk into a store and somebody else has put a label on me, I could walk in there thinking I'm a Norwegian male. And nobody is not going to see that. They're going to see a 5 foot tall African-American woman. And that will make a difference on how I experience myself, how I experience my body, how my posture, my comfort level, how I think I need to behave when I am in that space. So sort of going full circle back to that notion of identity as considerations of belonging and safety and mattering in the world is so important.
this goes exactly to what I was just about to mention, which is, to put it out there, and I've said this in a few forums, my identity, I walk in the world as a Black man and as an Afro-Latino, and that was coming to that understanding, particularly the term Afro-Latinx, Afro-Latino was really empowering for me, because before that, especially as a young kid, I found tension within myself around notions of being Black and being Latinx, or Latine. And it took me a while to understand, okay, so, my parents have these experiences. They're both Black people, but they also have these cultural experiences. And, not to go too far off down the rabbit hole of colonialism, but, they have certain historical experiences having been brought to this hemisphere, just on different parts of the North and South American continents, and trying to figure out, well, when somebody tells me you're Black, or somebody tells me you're Hispanic, to use the terms that I heard as a kid, and you either need to be over here or over there, I try to figure out, well, I'm not trying to deny my mother or my father. I'm not trying to deny my own history. And then ask myself the question, but do I have any political power or agency to sit in the middle? If I don't stand over here, stand over there, does that mean I'm alone, or I'm in such a small kind of group that we're going to get pushed around? So it was empowering, for me to be comfortable in who I am, my love of my own family, my acceptance of the good and bad of some of that heritage, and then to move forward, in society today. So to really stick it to a term, that was important, and me just being comfortable in my own skin.
Yeah. And to know that tension that you felt, you didn't put it there. It was put there by a world that needed to put you in some sort of a box, like you stand here or you stand there. And, in terms of, again, racecraft, one of the worst things that could happen in this country would be to be at the bottom of that rank ordering system, when you have a system that's based on white supremacy, white superiority, and Black inferiority. It is absolutely no surprise whatsoever that everybody's sort of scrambling, like, wait a minute, if there's a ladder, where do I fit in? And how do I keep myself, if I'm not going to be white, then how can I keep myself from being seen as the most abject of beings? People, it would show up in languages, language where, oh, well, it was almost a compliment in some places. Like, I grew up in the American South, right? So it was almost a compliment in some places to be seen as not, quote, just Black, like, that maybe there's something else that kind of, mixes it up a little bit, makes it a little bit better. Like, oh, are you sure? Are you sure you aren't part Indian? Based on some crazy notion of, probably from the Westerns that were on TV, about what that meant as well. And I think this notion of just the colorism that went along with that. I was talking with a group of people recently about just, if you look at some of those books that call themselves, like pictorial histories of African Americans or whatever, the farther you went back and the more elevated the positions, the lighter the skin, which made lots of sense. And I certainly remember, as a person working in public schools, going to public schools. I mean, I may have, my first career was as a public school teacher. And I could remember, people getting into like sort of fisticuffs and getting mad at each other because somebody might call somebody, well, you old black dog or something like that. And you think the dog part would be the problem, right? Mm-hmm. Well, it wasn't. Right. It was the black part. It was like, and our language matters. And when we're in this situation where there's so much language that talks about the negativity of Blackness, and then trying to decide, well, I know I claim this, but how do I stave off being demeaned by other people? It can create all kinds of tension, within us, between us and other people. And so much of it is not so much about wanting to be white. It's about wanting to matter. It's
Mhm.
about wanting to belong. It's about wanting to be safe in the world. And those are human desires. It's something we all need and want and should have.
That's a great point. It makes me think about that question of what brings us to some of the work that we do, and in an intrinsic way, it's feeling as though I got to a safer place and trying to figure out how do I offer some of that, or at least an example of the fact that it's possible to others who may also think maybe there is no place for me, in the community that I come into. I keep hearing about the barriers. I keep being told about the limitations. I'm
Mhm.
told about all the deficits
Mhm.
that I was apparently born into, or maybe it was born with. I can't remember,
Mhm.
right? Like it's hard to keep that
Yeah.
straight. And so there's that drive to say, it's possible to within yourself arrive at a place where you feel like you understand how you're connected and what your value is, and how you kind of bring that to bear on a regular basis. And I really feel that in a lot of the statements that you just made.
Mhm. I think this notion of being able also to, you know, you narrate your own life. We all have narratives, we all have stories that we live. But what is more demeaning than having to live a story that someone imposed on you because they look at you and say, oh, you must be deprived in some way? It's like, well, yes, now that I think about it, maybe I grew up poor, but at the time I wasn't quite so sure. I wasn't sure. And that wasn't the narrative that I was living. And I think so much of what can be liberating for all of us, particularly, I think a lot, I care a lot about young people, is to that, you have the power to write your narratives. You don't have to live into somebody else's small imagination of who you are.
That's a small imagination. I really like that term. I'm gonna steal that. I will credit you every time I use it when I'm talking to some of the young people in the program when I get a chance to. But that's a really good example, a really good image for what's happening. And I think you and I touched on this before. The notion of the ever shrinking pie, that there just
Yes,
isn't enough. That
right.
there's less and less. So you would better not worry about the next person, but worry about yourself.
Mm-hmm.
That is so damaging. And I
Mm-hmm.
think there are a lot of really good examples of how it's been used against communities like ours, the communities of color. And hey, you're only going to get so much from the powerful's table,
Right.
and mass is only got this much room. So if
Mm-hmm.
you're going to occupy that space, then you are going to have to forsake other folks who also have need. And I think that that's a really powerful notion, that we still hear and see every day. Every day, it's coming through social media. It's coming through us at the news and all our news, and it creates that anxiety. And it's very easy to slip in. Well, you better stick with your own kind. You better get with your racial designation real quick, because things are
Mm-hmm.
getting heated out here, and it's dangerous for all of us. And
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a purpose behind a lot of that.
Mm-hmm. I like that. The master's table, like take your crumbs, hoard them. Don't let anybody see how many you get. Don't even let them know how you got them. Because before you know it, they'll be trying to take yours, and there's just not
Exactly.
enough to go around. And it is this notion of scarcity is what can keep us so fearful of each other. And that is probably one of the worst things I think that happens to us in the world. So that okay, so maybe I learned to navigate these places or these spaces where I can't show up whole. I can't be a full human being. I've got to try to fit into somebody else's box or imagination of who I am. So maybe I end up at one of those historically elite schools. How do I leave there if I think I've got to survive by being that way? Once I leave, who do I leave as? You know, and how will I show up in the world, once I leave my institution? If I've learned that the only way to do it is to move a certain way, act a certain way, stay away from a certain group of people, make sure I'm not identified with the bad ones, then that can manifest in so many different ways in our lives.
Yeah, and feed off of the division. So if I'm, and I certainly was not, if I'm 19, 20, 22, 23, 24, and still working on myself to kind of make sure I get to that comfortable place. And then, I get asked, well, you've already made this enormous investment to be able to get to potentially an elite institution or some special program or get into some group. And now we're telling you, look, you got to hang with us. Yes, we may not be majority of whatever you consider your most important identities, but this is now a part of it, and you need to distance yourself, as you pointed out, from maybe some of these other folks that you consider yourself close to as part of your community. But we're telling you, if you're going to hang with us, you need to not worry about them and stick with us on our program. And how that, to your point, how it perpetuates itself. Now I'm growing and I'm like, well, okay, so now I have access, like this door opened and that door opened. But if I try to start talking about how I'm connected to this community or to this struggle or to this history, they're like, we don't want any of that in here. So now I'm thinking, well, I don't want to be pushed out of the room. I don't want to not get this job. I don't want to not be in this network. And all of a sudden now, again, right, it just works on the fissures and the cracks in my own sense of self and identity. Terrible for our wellness, as if we didn't have enough, working against us. Terrible for our mental health and our wellness.
Mental and physical health as well. I mean, isn't it? It's so sad and maddening that we get taught, okay, the price of progress, what we call progress, is that you have to disconnect from people who love you and people you've loved and people on whose shoulders you stand, because they aren't welcome here. There's only room for a few. If too many of you show up, somebody's got to go. and I think that has been one of the things that, as you said, that's fed the fissures that kept us divided, alienated from ourselves, alienated from community, from community as we need it, just sort of trying to live into that little tight, picture of who I'm supposed to be in order to be, quote, somebody.
And just to tie this, I know we'll come up on this probably in a minute, but to tie this to what we deal with, to think about wellness in school, you mentioned that being an elite university, maybe it's a certain job, a certain work environment. A lot of the signals and the norms in these spaces don't allow us to bring that reality, and would ask us to keep it outside of the room, and just perpetuates everything that you just talked about, and forces, I'll speak to my own experience. I've worked in spaces where talking about the differences between myself and maybe other people in the space becomes hazardous. We used to winter in the Hamptons, or we used to travel to X and Y place, and where did you go? And I have to say, well, that wasn't my experience. We did different things. We might have done this in the summer or that in the summer, and then that sense of separation, because of all the assumptions that come with it, not just, okay, well, you did something different, but now I think maybe you couldn't do it because of this, this, and this, or maybe I think you just don't understand where I'm coming from, and that I need to keep that in mind, that you may not actually be in my tribe because you didn't have the same experiences I did.
Right.
As a person.
And that difference also, when that difference is regarded as a deficiency, as some way in which you are lacking, it is a sad fact that all too often in my careers, I have heard possibly very well-meaning people say things like, oh, if we could only get them away from their families, like this kid has promise, but, the family just sort of drags them down. So the family is always seen as unhealthy. There's no effort to see what is joyful, what is affirming, what is helpful, what is actually healthy, so that the young people oftentimes think, well, I guess I should be ashamed of where I come from. I guess I should hide. And again, what does shame do? It just blocks us down. It makes it unsafe for us to move and to learn and to grow.
You know, and that just rings so true for me. One of the biggest hurdles, one of the biggest impediments that those of us who do not have privilege encounter is the need to identify, the need to come to deep understanding either early in life or kind of suffer with the struggle of getting there later, and what that creates. I think a lot of times people misunderstand that one element of privilege is simply not having to answer those questions until much later, but not really being affected by it in the same way, not having to justify outwardly. We all have to come to understanding internally with who we are, but not everyone moves in the world in a way where they have to come to find nuanced definitions of how they fit into the political system and whether they have value or don't have value. If it's understood, then it's something that I am unaware of. And I use the term privilege because then I could be ignorant of it. It's possible I don't even realize that it's like I've never had to come up with this long litany of who I am and where I come from and why I have value. And in workspaces and in other spaces, then that becomes an issue. Right? When we talk about equity and diversity, that becomes an issue because now some folks are blind to that need and don't know how to address it and think maybe it's not important, to your earlier point.
If that is, I think, an expression or a manifestation of normalized racism. I will tell a story that is possibly a bit embarrassing to my son, but also possibly not, probably not. But we
bring it on.
But as an adolescent, we were living in a town, and I guess I still do, that was probably 98% white, and there were hair salons and on everywhere he turned, there was somewhere somebody was blow drying hair, doing something. And one day after school, he just went into all of these salons and said, "Hey, can anybody in here cut my hair?" Now his friend was mortified and was saying, "You can't ask that question. You can't ask that question." It was like, right, yes, you can, because until you ask that question, your hair is problematized, not the lack of skill on the part of the people who work in the salon. And so unless we start to ask those questions, as long as we are always scrutinizing folks who've been minoritized, like, how did this happen? How did you become whatever, how did you get here? Typically is what people are asking. But as long as we are scrutinizing folks who become minoritized, we don't have to understand how people became white. And that's a process that a lot of people a few people I think have written very, very well about, but we don't pay a lot of attention to, because you can just do your race. You don't have to think about it. You don't have to think about how am I being seen by other people. I can just walk in. If I have a bad day, if I'm in a restaurant and I cut a cherry tomato and it flies across the floor, it's, I don't have to worry about, does this person belong in a restaurant? Have they ever eaten in a nice place before? Can they actually eat pasta without drooling? And then how does that show up?
My bag or my purse closer to me when they come in? Yeah.
And it's like, okay, if I make a mistake, I worked for years at Harvard Business School, and I thought so much. I had to think a lot about what William Cross called spotlight anxiety, because in this method of learning, which is case method, taking chances, with ideas, getting immediate feedback on your ideas. Well, if I feel as if who I am, my identity is consistent with people who belong at Harvard Business School, I can almost say anything. I can make a mistake. If I believe I'm being questioned, like, oh, did you get here through affirmative action? And how many people from your background have ever been here? And are you taking somebody else's seat more deserving than you? Then I don't have the freedom to learn in the same way. Because if I make a mistake, that mistake may not be just mine. It may be representative of the mistake of everybody who looks like me.
That is also so powerful to talk about. We talked about wellness. We talked about the burden of some of that, having to carry that knowledge, the conflict, the tension, and to bring that to work every day and try to excel in the same way that peers or colleagues that don't carry that burden. I've certainly experienced it personally, but also seen it in very close friends, that how that creates a lot of challenges for us, and again, in mental health and wellness. And I keep coming back to that because I think about how that can approach hostile, that can make an environment hostile, really, in the sense of feeling eyes are on you, you're being looked at, but not necessarily because of not for the same reasons that the majority of the group may be scrutinized, not necessarily for your work product, not necessarily for your ambition or your connection to your work, but because of who you are, and where you come from. And I think that, I've been in work environments where I think that that's so important to address it, but it's uncomfortable. And then sometimes we make the mistake of saying, well, that doesn't need to be in the workspace. And then, of course, it already is in the workspace. So
right.
It's, in the proclamation, we don't need to bring that in here. But those of us who know, it's like, no, I'm walking around with it every day. Like, it's here. I'm asking you to acknowledge that this is happening, and let us not pretend that this doesn't exist in the space, whether it's bias, both conscious and or unconscious, whether it's direct prejudice. Let's address these things. And I think that that's a huge part of the conversation that leaders like yourself and others are kind of slowly moving us in the direction of.
I was recently speaking with a young woman who works in a DEI space at an elite institution. And she was talking about one experience in which someone in another department said, hey, well, this stuff is coming up around diversity and equity. And I don't really know that much about it. So would you come over here and help me do my job? And I said to her, well, first of all, now, is this unpaid? And secondly, what part of your job can you just announce? Well, that's not my wheelhouse. And so can somebody else just come and do it for me? So long as we are using all of these euphemisms about diversity and equity and inclusion, and not talking about the work that race does to shrink us from our full humanity, without talking about how the work of the rank ordering, that kind of thing can happen, all of the time. And as a part of that privilege of, I don't have to be competent in certain areas because it really isn't that important. Somebody else whose job it is to be aware of these issues, they can come and do that for me until I get tired. And then they can go back and do whatever else it is they do while I do the real work.
Right. Yeah. Notions of real work. Right.
Yeah.
And I'm just, I can't help but think how often I've thought in this context, I'm in a conversation and it takes me a while to realize that in this context, what they mean by real work is my pre-existing networks, my pre-existing understanding of who I am in this dynamic, not necessarily the work that I've done for this project or that I've brought into this room around what we're discussing. But you are in one space and I'm in another, and we just need to recognize those social differences. And that again, that's the conversation. That's where what we need to be talking about when we figure out how to bring greater equity into a lot of different spaces and into work. Mm-hmm. And I've been involved directly in conversations around the notion of equity in philanthropy and equity in grant making. And those are interesting conversations because we're talking about hegemony. I had a long conversation with somebody the other day. So philanthropy exists largely because of social hegemony and the ability to say, well, I have accrued more than this vast group. And so I have the ability then to kind of feed into where the need is. I can give some of these resources back, and what that means, and how we introduce equity into a system that has for so long been about patronage and about kind of tribe and network.
Right. Unnamed patronage. Yeah. It's called meritocracy. I mean that's often what it's called, meritocracy. Bootstrapping, doing stuff on your own, when that's never been the case. When that's never been the case ever.
Yeah. That's a great question. And there are two things that spring to mind. The first is I'm going to throw this out. You can edit this later. But the first thing that pops into my head is like, Uncle Tom, like, what are you doing? Not for everyone, but for still a lot of people. Yeah, we know who that is. We know what they did to us. What are you doing over there? Trying to tell us that you're part of a solution or moving in the right direction, but also representing that organization and that group. So I just fully transparently want to throw that out. That's a part of this equation for those of us who are coming from our communities, to say, well, I'm going to be with the institution and I'm going to try to drive change in that way and on that end. But with regard to the kind of larger framing of the fact that I'm working in a space where inequity has been reinforced in many instances, and it is not a secret, right? Like, at least not if you pay any attention. It's a matter of public record, and in spaces where we've had to deal with that, the fact that everybody knows this happened, and that was done on purpose. So what do you have to say about it now? My goal, the two things I would say about that. My goal, one, is to in fact drive in the right direction and say, you know what, the first step, and maybe this is the most important thing that someone coming from the community that I come from in East New York and Brooklyn, having so little knowledge growing up of kind of these larger systems and schema, but now understanding, can say is like, we need to acknowledge this, fully acknowledge it. Well, how are we going to get to a better place if we can't say, yes, redlining happened? If we can't say, yes, these things were institutionalized, they were systemic, and the impact was devastating. And now we move from that point, right, to say, how would we make change? How will we get better? What's that coalition even look like? Some people want to make sure that the brand continues. We don't want to have a lot of negativity out there about our brand. Some people are thinking we need to make community better. Others may feel like I want to feel as though I've made progress, right, from what was. So maybe it's not perfect, but I don't want to feel as though it's as bad as it was. And how do we build that coalition and move them forward with the understanding that first we got to acknowledge it happened fully. And I think we might be at the tip, even though that may have been happening for maybe 40 years, we're still kind of at the tip of being able to really wrap our minds culturally around what that is, what the history of our country is.
All of the ways that our interactions are structured and regulated in this country. So I love it that you said that. Redlining happened. Redlining is happening. I had the sad opportunity just a few weeks ago to be in a neighborhood where there is no grocery store. It's an absolute food desert. I was, driving by houses that I thought, okay, this is what is called neighborhood blight. But guess what? People are also living there. So, this notion of just acknowledging that this has happened and is still happening is certainly a first step. And I think being in those positions, as you talked about, where you can try to drive change, being in those positions enables us to say things like, okay, so what are we doing right now still that perpetuates inequity? And until we start doing that, that's an uncomfortable question. And a part of what we know about power is that if you have, power wants to be comfortable. They don't want to, does not want to hear complaints. But, being in those positions where you can ask those uncomfortable questions, what are we doing right now? And until we can do that, then philanthropy becomes a way of touching down. It's a way of maintaining the status quo, really. I mean, and of course, we love the grants, but we have to have more. We do have to have resources put in places where it belongs. But it also doesn't need to be seen as some gift or some giveaway. It's like everybody should have good food. Everybody should have nutritious food. People should not have to get all of their meals from Wawa or nothing against Wawa. Actually, I've never been in one, but that was see. But I do understand that I've been told by people who did grow up thinking, okay, that was knowing that was the source of nutrition. People should have access to education. We should not have to go around being anxious about whether our kids can get good books and can get books that tell the truth, not books that are geared toward the politics of the state. And until we are able to start, really pushing hard on notions like that, then philanthropy itself will be seen as, oh, it's a gift, it's a giveaway for which disadvantaged people should be grateful.
Mm-hmm. That's right. That's right. The folly of connecting moral value to, whether you have a home, whether you have access to nutritious food, and the notion that there's some sort of intrinsic moral value that you are a good person or bad person by virtue of the fact that you have access to that or that you can find it. And that is, again, just another little tool to make sure that we can kind of keep things moving as they have been, to say that there's something intrinsically wrong with folks who wind up in a situation where they have that particular need at any given point. And I just think that that's a really powerful statement that, this is, again, purposeful, there's agency within it. But I will say that to the point of trying to move institutions in the right direction, that I believe, it's a personal belief, that there's a bell curve when it comes to folks and their genuine desire to bring misery to other people. I think that there are a lot of folks who go along to get along and are not looking to create misery. And those are the folks we want to talk to. Right.
Not everybody wakes up every day saying, geez, who got oppressed today? But people do wake up wanting to get along. People do wake up wanting to stay comfortable. And sometimes just that staying comfortable is a surefire way to create misery.
Just to kind of double click on that point, there's a group that can be moved in, and sometimes I'm in that group. Very often there may be an issue or a subject that I'm not well versed on, or I'm not aware of, and somebody comes and educates me and makes me understand, hey, these are people's lives.
Yes.
And if we're bettering people's lives, then we will all be better for it. And I think to go back to that, the myth of the ever shrinking pie, it's important to understand. You mentioned if people need food, what are you inferred? Why would we not want to make sure that if we had it within our power, that they had access to it? How could that reflect or impact society writ large in a negative way? And I think that's an important question, because oftentimes people look to obscure it by saying, well, the economy works like this, or, you don't understand the supply chain or how our food supply works. And it's like, okay, fair enough, right? I'll hear you out. But oftentimes what happens is that becomes a war of attrition. And by the time they get to, page 37, I'm not focused anymore. And I never really hear that there wasn't a good reason. They just kind of burn us out on a lot of jargon and a lot of nonsense, quite frankly, before we get to the point.
We are quick to ascribe immorality to people who don't have access. We are quick to scrutinize their decisions. But, do we talk about the morality of, say, a national budget that says, oh, we need to spend as much money as we can to militarize police. We need to spend as much money as we can to go out and destroy other nations. We need to spend all this money and make sure people are making money on mass incarceration. That's, those are moral issues. And oh, no, we don't have the money to ensure that we have a good, say, teacher-student ratio in our classrooms, and that, people have the right materials or adequate materials to help them be excited about learning.
Yeah, and that's the materials question. That's such a great point. Such a hot button issue. The question of education, educational standards, access, resources, and the way in which it is used locally, normally in a state, but more often than not in a community, in a neighborhood, to exemplify some sort of larger cultural battle, when in fact, that's a space where you pull parents, right, engaged, concerned parents into a room, and you have a lot of common cause.
Yes.
But everything that we've described, right, is used. And people who want to be able to succeed in kind of breaking up that sense of common purpose for parents who want to see their children have access and have the opportunity for a good standard of living and a decent life. They've got to work hard to make sure that those folks don't come together around access to materials, books, safe classrooms. Like you said, nutritious food, during the day. Despite the fact that there's so much commonality, we see a lot of friction and conflict. It's used as a battleground in a lot of spaces. The sense of being able to have an impact that would matter to my community, and by my community, I mean people who are Black and people who are Latine and people who are Afro-Latin and people who come from Brooklyn and New York, and all those connected in a lot of ways to that diaspora is what helped me. It became the fuel for me to challenge myself to enter spaces that honestly I would have never imagined myself walking into, and telling people, yep, I belong in here. You should let me work on X, Y, and Z. I will direct some of this work. And so the things that I thought as a kid that were deficiencies, and I didn't make that clear earlier, but when I said I was struggling with identity, there are a lot of things I thought, you don't belong over there. This is where you belong. Without these things, without these resources, those very same experiences I was able to turn into motivation when I started to understand my community and my history more, to help propel me into those spaces and say to myself, these people must not truly understand in some way, shape, or form what's happening. And so my presence will support that education. I'll be someone who has a greater understanding and a greater connection.
Something that just flashed in my mind was my great-grandmother's flower gardens and her vegetable gardens. And, she lived, again, I think she was born like probably, Reconstruction was probably just ending when she was born. She was very poor. She could not read or write. And she had what was called a shotgun house, and she had flowers everywhere. Anything that had a bottom, had flowers growing in it. And, she had a dirt yard, which she kept raked all of the time. And she didn't want people to walk on it when she raked it, because it was so pretty. What I'm getting at is how much she loved beauty, and how that beauty was expressed. And so much someone could come and look and see just deprivation. And what I am seeing, as I think about that now, I'm seeing the beauty. I'm seeing the urge to create. I am seeing the urge to say, here is who I am that's larger than you might ever imagine that I can be. Here's where I find my joy. Here I find it in my music. I find it in movement and dancing. I find it in laughter. And, those are the things that I think about when the world says there was, and I'm sort of jumping all over the place, but I think I'm quoting Janie Victoria Ward, who said that we have to work with young people to instill in them a belief that is greater than other people's disbelief. Mm. And that is where I see the role of joy. I see the role of joy as resistance. I see the role of looking at our communities for forms of indigenous healing. When we laugh, we know that joy makes oppressors uncomfortable. Like, what are they laughing about? What are you talking about? What are they laughing about? So, and being able to just claim those spaces for ourselves and know that our stories are much, much larger, who we are and who we are becoming, who we can't, it's a never ending story. And we can keep growing that story.